Set that to record. Turn toward me. There we go. We'll see if we can't capture this so we can help that. I know a lot of people have been sending emails and texts, and I've been getting calls not just from people here in the church, but also from colleagues wanting to know what on earth happened and what does it mean for us. So I thought it was just a good idea for us to pull together, even though the weather wasn't ideal, to just talk about what happened and to process a little bit about what that might mean for us moving forward. And then we'll just take your questions. I know there might be several questions. We'll see if we can't answer them, many of them kind of off the bat. But so to catch you all up, some of you may be entering into this craziness sort of midstream. But to catch you all up, at the United Methodist Church meets every 4 years for something called General Conference. And General Conference is a collection of delegates from annual conferences from across the globe, not just the United States, from the United States, of course, Africa, especially Africa, large contingent from Africa. We've got folks from the Philippines, from Europe. There was even a Norwegian at the conference the last couple of times, and speaks impeccable English with a Norwegian accent. Love it. And then Eastern Europe, and even a provisional conference in Russia. So we've got a global nature to the church, people of all shapes and sizes. And to describe a little bit about a general conference generically, this is a large body of no more than 1,000 people. The delegates are assigned to annual conferences based on the population of Methodists in those conferences. So the more Methodists you have, the more delegates you get. To give you some indication, the Legacy Rocky Mountain Conference, that's the conference that we were a part of until we merged last summer. The Rocky Mountain Conference, last time we elected delegates, we had 3 clergy delegates and 3 lay delegates. The delegates are evenly split between clergy and laity. And the clergy could be anything from pastors like myself in local churches to district superintendents and other official offices, even professors of theology and various things at seminaries. There were even a couple of seminary presidents that were elected delegates from their conferences. So, but clergy and laity from all walks of life. They speak probably more languages, but the print materials are officially translated into 4 languages. Let's see. English, of course, is the primary language of the conference, and then French, German, and Kiswahili. Many of the African delegates speak some native language in Africa, but also French is very. But in addition to the print materials, the conference, as it's happening, because it's a debate, and it's just like Congress almost, and although a little less productive maybe after this peak. Just kidding. That's my sense of humor coming out. The conference is interpreted on the fly into like 7 languages: Portuguese, Spanish, French, Russian. I'm missing several, but there are interpreters in booths listening on the microphone, on headphones to what's being said by the bishop leading and the delegates and the presenters, and then translating that and interpreting it for the international delegates who were frequently seen wearing headsets so that they could understand what was going on. So you can imagine this is an incredibly complex thing. If you need something made 10 times more complicated than it needs to be, give it to the United Methodist Church and we'll do it for you. But that's how we do it. This General Conference was made up of the same delegates as the 2016 General Conference. 2016 was the last normal calendared General Conference. We meet every 4 years. And we elect our delegates for a 4-year term. So the delegates that were elected for the 2016 conference remain in office technically until the new delegation is elected this summer at annual conferences coming up. And so the same people that were at the 2016 conference were brought back into service this past weekend in St. Louis. So that gives you some idea. There were the body then and now was made up of 864 delegates from, 4 continents? Something like that? Yeah, 4 continents. And of the 864 delegates, I'm told there were about 30 that were unable to travel for various reasons because of visa issues and travel problems from war-torn areas and such, that there were about 30 delegates from Africa that were unable to make it. So there were about 830-ish, 834, something like that, delegates, and you saw that in the votes if you were following along or if you've read any material since the conference about it, reporting on it. There were about 830 folks. The one vote was actually 409 to 409. That was the first time I'd ever seen a tie in a vote on General Conference. But it was a conference of a lot of firsts and unusual sights. So the reason for this conference, this was, if you read my article leading up to this conference in the Broadcaster, you may remember that this was a very unique conference in that it's the first one since 1970 that is called Special General Conference, which is between regular General Conference meetings. The bishops are empowered to call a special conference to deal with this issue or that issue, whatever's important. In 1970, it was, okay, we've merged as a United Methodist Church. What on earth does that mean? So it was sort of a uniting, how do we be church together conference. We haven't had a special general conference since that conference. So it's been, almost 50 years since 48 years, whatever, since we had a special general conference. So very unusual just in that. And the reason we had one was as a result of action taken in 2016. In 2016, there were some folks who were very nervous about the way the General Conference was going to address issues of sexuality in our church, and they called on the bishops to lead, and they did. So they came up with this idea of creating a commission. It's very Methodist to come up with a committee, right, to deal with something. Let's put together this commission that would examine this issue from all different sides and all of the places in the discipline that address it, and come back with a comprehensive plan for a way forward. That was the origin of their name. They were called the Commission on a Way Forward. So they brought this before the 2016 General Conference. They tabled all of the issues, or all of the petitions that would have dealt with these passages in the discipline, and they empowered the bishops to appoint this commission and to call a special General Conference to deal with just this issue in our church. So they did that. That fall, this was in late April, early May of 2016. That fall, they took nominations from various bishops about people to be a part of that commission, and they brought together what's been described as one of the most diverse groups maybe ever assembled in the United Methodist Church. There were people from all walks of life. There were clergy, there were laity, there were bishops, about a third of each, a third bishops, a third laity, and a third clergy. There were people on all different spectrums, from the most progressive sides of things, wanting the church to completely change, to the people who have been fighting for decades to keep the church where it is, and everyone in between, all different levels of the church, and brought them together. They met over about 18 months, and they crafted what became 3 basic plans. And you may remember, if you've been in these meetings before, the 3 basic plans consisted of a traditional plan, which would retain the language in the discipline and strengthen some enforcement measures. And then there was what was called the One Church Plan, which would remove all of the specific language about sexuality and marriage in the discipline, and then empower the annual conferences, particularly the clergy session. It's called the executive session. It's the clergy plus the Board of Ordaining Ministry. So a few laity in there, but mostly clergy, would decide whether or not the conference was going to ordain folks of alternative sexualities. And then the churches themselves would be empowered to decide whether or not they were going to host same-sex marriages, weddings. And pastors would be empowered to decide whether they would preside over them or not. The theory being that all of those strata would then respect each other, essentially, in whatever decision they decided to make. And then they proposed a third, more innovative but more daunting plan that was called the Connectional Conference Plan, that basically kept some big umbrella ideas as a sort of an umbrella United Methodist Church, but then broke the rank and file into basically up to three different denominations that kind of separated based on the way they wanted to handle this issue. You'd have basically three sub-denominations that would be under the umbrella of the United Methodist Church. So they gathered. That's what the St. Louis General Conference was all about. They gathered last Saturday, 2 Saturdays ago, 8 days ago. They began their first day with prayer and worship, and some instruction from a parliamentarian, which they desperately needed, and then some how are we going to handle the rest of the conference moving forward. And part of the confusion with the conference that a lot of people had was there are rules in the General Conference for how to do General Conference. And normally General Conference is like a 2-week marathon where you're in meetings for 2 straight weeks. I did that in 2012 as a reserve delegate, and that is you're done with meetings for your life after 2 weeks of General Conference. So normally it's designed as a 2-week marathon. The first week is subcommittees that deal specifically with particular issues, right? So the General Conference in a whole is split up into about 13 what are called legislative committees. And they each take part of the thousands of petitions that come in based on, they kind of separate them out by subject. And then those come back to the plenary, which is the full General Conference, and they're empowered to act to either change or leave the discipline the same. General Conference is the only body that has the power to do that, to change the discipline. And so the problem was applying those rules that work really well for a 2-week meeting into basically a 3-day meeting. And so they had to come up with some creative ways to do that. And the reason they didn't just change the rules is because at the 2016 General Conference, they spent 3 days debating the rules before they adopted them. Yes, they did. So they couldn't waste time adopting new rules. They needed just to work within that framework and move forward. So they did. They created one whole legislative committee that encompassed all of the delegates that were present, and so then they went about. First of all, on Sunday, they heard all the plans presented by the Commission on a Way Forward, and then in the afternoon they did basically a straw poll. They did a preference check for the conference. They went through every petition before the General Conference. All 3 plans, which were several petitions each, and then several petitions that were submitted by other people and groups throughout the denomination. And they went through each one, and every delegate present could give it a high priority or a low priority. Those were your 2 choices. And you could do that. You could vote as many as you wanted as a high priority. So if you're taking count and losing fingers, they could vote high priority for as many as they wanted. And then what they did is they used that information to basically organize their work. And based on the expression of high priority from the body, the highest priority issue was to fix the pension. And you might be wondering, what on earth does the pension have to do with anything? Part of the problem was anticipating there might be a lot of tension and perhaps fallout from a General Conference. There were some issues with the pension plan that really needed to be made more solid to have the accountants in the denomination sort of be able to sleep. So pensions was the highest priority, probably because the most people agreed that it was an important thing to fix. And basically what that means is taking care of clergy who have dedicated their lives to serving and have now retired. And they want to make sure that the pension plan is solvent and fruitful for those clergy. So they did that first. Then they ranked the traditional plan, second highest priority, followed by 2 different plans that would allow churches to what's called disaffiliate from the denomination if they chose. So two different petitions that would allow a church to leave the UMC. and then the one church plan followed those, and likewise down. I can't remember where the connectional conference plan came in. It was like 12% it got, something like that, when the pensions got like 65%. So it was clear that from the straw poll where people's hearts were, essentially, in what they wanted to prioritize. So after they did that, they launched into their work. They became a legislative committee. They elected officers. So the first day, Monday, when they really dug in and started tinkering with these petitions, was led by a clergy person, but not a bishop. Most General Conference sessions like that are led by bishops. But this one was led by a pastor out of Oklahoma who was elected the chairperson of the legislative committee. And he led them through the Monday work. They started with the pension and passed that pretty fast. They got to the traditional plan and they tinkered with it a little bit, and then they passed that. All of this is where the confusion happened. So the body approved these different petitions or didn't approve them, and then they did it all over again Tuesday. It seemed like a little Groundhog Day-like. If you were watching on the live stream and you didn't understand the rules, it could have seemed very much like Groundhog Day. So they passed the traditional plan. They tinkered with and passed both of the exit petitions that followed that in order of priority. And then they spent a great deal of time debating the one church plan. And ultimately, when it came up for a vote, they did not approve the one church plan. Most of these votes were 55-45. I mean, just about right down the docket. Whenever they took a vote on one of these issues, except for the pension, it was about 55-45. And it was breaking toward the traditional plan and supporting petitions for that. There was, again, Groundhog Day, so all of the work that was done on Monday then gets recommended, all the stuff that passes on Monday, then gets recommended to the full plenary on Tuesday. This is where it gets a little weird because it's the same delegates. So you think we're taking two votes on the same thing. Strange. When that typically happens on the floor of General Conference, there's an opportunity for a group from within a legislative committee to form what's called a minority report. And you guys are all getting a lesson in parliamentary procedure here, but a minority report is when you have a significant enough minority that didn't vote for the original petition that's being passed on to General Conference to be able to submit a minority report that would be an alternative to the legislation that was passed by the legislative session. So the legislative session passed the traditional plan and not the one church plan. Well, a minority report was brought to reintroduce the one church plan as an alternative main motion. And essentially what you do is then you debate which one you want to deal with. Do you want to do the majority report, which is the plan that passed legislative committee, or do you want to deal instead with the minority report? This actually makes a lot more sense when the two bodies are different. When the legislative committee is, a tenth of the whole conference, there's a better chance that a minority report could win the day, and then that becomes what you deal with instead. In this case, it was the same people. So the folks who supported the one church plan were very passionate and well organized, and presented the one church plan as a minority report to the traditional plan. And ultimately, that was voted down by the same sort of 55-45-ish split. You can look up the numbers, they're public records, so you can look up the votes if you're interested. But they were between 30, they were between 53.5 and like 56, but it was mainly 55-45-ish, something like that, pretty consistently, unless someone was in the restroom, I guess. Then they went ahead and there was kind of a breakdown on Tuesday. After it was clear the one church plan was not going to pass. To give you some context, the one church plan was the preferred plan by about 2/3 of the bishops. It was the plan the bishops intended to present and tried to only present that plan to the General Conference. So it had a lot of support. The bishops even set up a website to advocate for it. Groups from across the connection were advocating for it, and it was sort of championed as the the plan to go. And so for the traditional plan to sort of win the day was for some people very shocking. And but like I said, the votes to up or down the traditional plan and up or down on the one church plan fell pretty much in line with even where the prioritization votes landed. So you probably could have read the tea leaves on Sunday afternoon and sort of predicted where the conference was going to go from there. But so when it became clear the one church plan was not going to win, and they were going to move on to the traditional plan, there were some protests that broke out as a part of that. If any of you watched the live stream, it was quite jarring, honestly. I spent a great deal of time watching the live stream over, especially Monday and Tuesday, and the difference between Monday's proceedings and Tuesday's were very stark. It became kind of an effort. The one church plan supporters then changed when they couldn't get the one church plan going. Then they changed tactics to delay a vote on the traditional plan in hopes that they would run out the clock, essentially. They had a hard deadline of 6:30 Central Time on Tuesday to finish their work because, appropriately enough, there was a monster truck rally coming in the next day. And so they had to clear out these Methodists so that they could bring in some dirt and some monster trucks. And so we knew that the conference was going to end at 6:30, and anything that wasn't dealt with by the end of the day on Tuesday would just disappear into the vapor, essentially, and wouldn't be dealt with. And there were some impassioned speeches. There were some attempts to amend the traditional plan in various ways. There were several several amendments that needed to happen to the traditional plan that didn't, that's sort of another wrinkle in this whole mess is that a couple of times throughout General Conference, including before General Conference, the Judicial Council, if you're not familiar with our polity, is sort of like our Supreme Court. They reviewed all three plans and ruled some of the one church plan, some minor things in the one church plan, out of harmony with our Constitution, and not the United States Constitution, our church's Constitution. And the traditional plan had some other flaws that were a little bit more serious, but could have been dealt with probably with the proper amendments. But at one other time during the session, after some amendments, there was a request that they look at it again on Monday. And so they looked at it like 10 o'clock in the evening on Monday night. I tell you what, you're tired of meetings at the end of this. I do not want to be one of those judicial council members. They looked at it again and said, yes, these problems still exist in the one church plan. There are about half of it, as it was currently stated, was unconstitutional. Traditional plan, I'm sorry, yeah, the traditional plan was unconstitutional. And then they didn't have an opportunity, there wasn't an opportunity in the time constraints to amend the one church plan, and so it was adopted knowing that can you tell it's been a long week? The traditional plan, not having time to amend the traditional plan to hopefully bring it into harmony with the Constitution, they very hurried with like about 45 minutes left on the clock, moved a vote of the traditional plan and adopted it, knowing that probably about half of it at least would be ruled unconstitutional. And then they then passed one of the exit provisions that they had adopted the day before as church law, but some complications with that as well, stemming from Judicial Council and another minority report. Is anybody confused yet? Can you believe all this lives in my head? Can you imagine being me sometimes? Look, Mom, no notes. The exit plan that was passed was designed to make it more difficult and would make it probably prohibitive for almost any congregation to really take advantage of. It basically left it as a matter of judicial council interpretation would require a 2/3 vote of the congregation wanting to leave, and then a 2/3 vote of the annual conference that church is a part of in order to leave. And then it would require the completion of the previous year's apportionments and a full payment of the following year's apportionments, and then to cover any unfunded liability in the pension program, which was doled out by some complicated formula I will never understand. And then there was even some amendments to the pension petition that would have allowed for a conference to basically assess any other fees associated with the church leaving that the conference desired. So to put it into some sort of perspective, it would cost us somewhere in the neighborhood of, and this is just rough, $100,000 for a church our size to decide if we wanted to leave. And it would take a vote of our church, of course, and then a vote of the annual conference. So you can see why that's probably too high a hurdle for most congregations. And so we're left with an unconstitutional traditional plan with a few provisions that did pass that will likely be a part of things moving forward. And then basically a non-functioning exit strategy that won't really exit anybody. So that's what they did. Those are the two things: the pension, the traditional plan, and as slightly amended, and then this one exit provision as amended. What else can I tell you? So some of the provisions of the traditional plan that have been ruled constitutional would include a more specific definition in the context of ordination about the definition of a self-avowed practicing homosexual and how to identify that someone is in that category. So there was some of that. There was some strengthening of provisions around ordination and consecration of bishops. And then there were some assurances from boards of ordained ministry and bishops that they would abide by the Book of Discipline, essentially. But the parts that were unconstitutional and will not go into effect have to do with the creation of a global episcopacy committee. Episcopacy is a fancy word for bishops, and the global episcopacy committee that was a part of the unconstitutional pieces of the traditional plan would have created an independent commission or an independent body that would have sole responsibility for the reviewing of complaints and the adjudicating of discipline for bishops who weren't abiding by the discipline. That body has complications with our Constitution for lots of very ironic and strange reasons. Little history here. In the 1840s, the United Methodist Church split over slavery into North and South over, interestingly enough, the election of a bishop who owned slaves. And the Northerners couldn't deal with that. They weren't going to have that. So the church split in the mid-1840s and into North and South. When they finally came back together 90 years later in what then became the Methodist Church in 1939, there were concerns in merging that there would be African American churches that would promote pastors to bishop and then would be imposed on conferences in the South. So the Southern conferences didn't want to risk having African American bishops forced on them. So what they did is they came up with a compromise. And their compromise was to establish what was then called the Central Conference. And 5 jurisdictions: Northeast, Southeast, North Central, South Central, and West. 5 jurisdictions. And then that would be the United States. And then over the entirety of the United States, there would be a Central Conference where all of the traditionally African American churches would be collected. And that would be separate. And then they ensconced in our Constitution at the time strict provisions that made the election and consecration of bishops the sole property of the jurisdiction. So only a jurisdiction can elect its own bishops and assign them to the conferences. And of course that was to sort of solidify, honestly, racism in the structure of the church in 1939. But that was what they had to do to compromise to bring the church together. At least that's the general wisdom. Fast forward to when we merged with the Evangelical United Brethren 30 years later, and the central conferences were the traditional African American churches in the United States were reassigned to their appropriate annual conferences, and the Central Conference, as it was done away with. Central Conference now refers to any conference outside the United States. So we have international conferences called Central Conferences, and then we have the jurisdictions in the U.S. You're like, why are you telling me this? Well, because what happens is when an entire jurisdiction decides it's going to do something, especially around Episcopal elections, there's virtually nothing our Constitution will allow another jurisdiction or even the Council of Bishops, or as it turns out, even the General Conference, to do about it. So there's sort of this enforcement thing. And because that's in our Constitution, that's why so many of these provisions to create this oversight committee for the global United Methodist Church kept running into these constitutional issues. So that's the crux of the problem. I'm going to shut up here in a minute, and we'll see what questions you have. The Judicial Council received one final request from the General Conference, which was passed in the waning minutes of the conference, to have the Judicial Council review the now passed traditional plan for its constitutionality. And they will not be reviewing that immediately. They will review it at their normal meeting time at the end of April, so the day or two after Easter. They'll meet and review, the Judicial Council will, the traditional plan as it was finally adopted in the various ways it was amended. And that's when we'll probably know what of the traditional plan will become church law, essentially. We might also get a little clarity about the exit path one as well. But timelines. So let's see. I told you about Judicial Council. One of the first questions I've received from people after sort of getting this review in some form or another is, what does that mean for the bishop of the Mountain Sky Conference? As many of you know, in addition to all of this going on in the general church, the Western jurisdiction in 2016 elected our first married lesbian bishop in our history, Dr. Oliveto, and upon her election and consecration, she was assigned to be the bishop of the Rocky Mountain and Yellowstone annual conferences, which sort of stirred up a lot in the denomination, but particularly in our conference, as it became a very real sort of issue for here. Because of that jurisdictional separation, and because of the unconstitutionality of the components in the traditional plan that was passed, there's nothing new as far as enforcement that will affect the current bishop. There are charges for performing same-sex weddings, which are still not allowed in our denomination, and even heresy charges that have been filed with the College of Bishops. This is where vocabulary becomes important. The College of Bishops refers to the bishops of a jurisdiction. So the Western jurisdiction has a College of Bishops. And then we have the Council of Bishops, which is all the bishops across the whole world. So the College of Bishops is charged with receiving and adjudicating any complaints against their fellow bishops. And they haven't explicitly said this, but the general wisdom was that they were sitting on the various charges that have come to them from across the church regarding Oliveto until this conference happened. Because if the one church plan had passed, then virtually all of those charges would be moot, and they wouldn't have to deal with them. Now they should have been dealt with months, even in at least a couple cases more than a year ago. And so time will tell whether they'll actually move forward with those or if they'll continue to just sit on them. And as I mentioned before, because of the way our church is sort of bifurcated in that particular area, it's hard for a group outside the jurisdiction to bring about any kind of enforcement there. So officially, her situation still seems to lie outside the boundaries of our discipline and our denomination, as it was reaffirmed at the General Conference. But only time will tell what that will really mean on the ground for us here. Trying to think if there's any other questions that I've had. Okay, I think you're probably tired of me, so I will open it up to you all. Bob?
Yeah, I don't have anything to say long. So what is the present status of the church's attitude toward same-sex marriage?
Okay.
And the second thing is, what was the other thing? Whether gay people could be bishops? Is that a question?
Yeah. So.
And so what is the present situation of the church on those two issues?
Okay. The marriage one is the simplest to probably explain. The church in our discipline currently defines marriages between one man and one woman, and the clergy are prohibited from presiding over same-sex marriages, and churches and other United Methodist-owned buildings and facilities are prohibited from hosting same-sex weddings.
Is that a description of something that's been in place for a long time?
It is, yeah.
So one of the issues before the conference was, would we change that?
Yes.
And the answer to that question is, not now.
Not now, yeah. That would be the best description.
Well, but it's still an open question.
Yeah, and that's the thing is, so sort of lurking in the back of all of our church nerdy minds is the fact that we're 14 months away from the next regularly scheduled general conference where all of this could be up for debate again.
Yeah.
So that's, yeah. So to answer your question, yeah, the policy has been since 1972 officially in our discipline that prohibits the hosting and conducting of same-sex marriages and defines marriage between one man and one woman. And then to your question about gay clergy, the discipline outlines that the practice of homosexuality is incompatible with Christian teaching, and therefore the language in the discipline is self-avowed practicing homosexuals are not permitted to be ordained, commissioned, or licensed as ministers in the United Methodist Church. And that has been the policy for, you're going to stretch my history. So the incompatible with Christian teaching language entered the discipline in 1972. Expressions of what that means for ordination came, I think, and someone, don't quote me on this, I think it was around 1980 was when that became formally expressed in ordination. But that has been the policy, either in practice or in formal policy, for almost 50 years in the United Methodist Church. Yeah.
So, as far as the position of the church for a long period of time is concerned, that second commandment that Jesus said was the basis of all the laws and commandments, to love your neighbor as yourself. There's an except line that isn't in the Bible, but we're now faced with that. We love our neighbor as ourselves, except if they happen to be gay neighbors.
Well, I would push back on that characterization a little bit, in that the way that the discipline talks about it is that all people, and I wish I had my discipline with me, all people are of sacred worth, and all are welcome in the church, and all are deserving of God's love. Nothing can separate us from the love of God, and the commandment that you cite to love each other. The question is a matter of, do we accept practice or not in that situation? Does that make sense? That's the distinction the discipline makes. Now, you might argue with that distinction, but that's the distinction the discipline makes. So there have been some characterizations that the United Methodist Church has banned all gay people, and that's just not true. There are prohibitions against people who practice homosexuality in certain positions of leadership. And then there's the distinction about marriage.
So there is an except.
You can interpret it that way. I would say that others interpret it differently, but I've heard that interpretation. Yes. Yeah, Janelle?
I have a big voice. So who of the Mountain Sky makes up our judicial council? Like with Mickey and Bob, since like Bob, he doesn't. Like who?
The Judicial Council?
Or in our group. So my understanding is, Bob kind of explained to me, is if there's charges brought up against a bishop, basically the same people that voted that bishop in are going to be the same people that will decide the discipline of the charges brought up on that bishop.
Mm-hmm.
So who's in that for our Mountain Sky? Who's in that?
So with issues of clergy, if a clergy person like myself were to be charged with something, one of the chargeable offenses, there are a dozen or something chargeable offenses, then those are adjudicated by a committee at the annual conference that's made up of mostly clergy. I think there's some laity from the Board of Ordained Ministry a part of that. When it comes to bishops, so bishops, they're still ordained elders. In order to be elected bishop, you have to be an ordained elder in good standing, is the language. And so for bishops, even though they're elders, they're consecrated to the office of bishop, and that's a lifelong consecration. And so bishops are kind of their own sort of strata, if you will. And so for charges with regard to bishops, those go to the College of Bishops. So there are 5 active bishops, and I believe 3 retired bishops, if memory serves, maybe 4 now, retired bishops that make up the College of Bishops in the Western jurisdiction. All charges are received by the president of the College of Bishops, which is, what is his name now? Bob's from the North Central jurisdiction. He doesn't know. His name's escaping me. I don't remember where he is. I think he's in Desert Southwest now, actually. But anyway, the president of the College of Bishops receives those, and the College of Bishops then works out either a just resolution, which is kind of like a plea bargain, or this is our life in the church. Or takes it to a trial, and that would be a part of the jurisdictional episcopacy committee's responsibility to coordinate that. So essentially, yes, the bishops who are colleagues with our bishop and the culture of the Western jurisdiction would essentially adjudicate a charge against one of our bishops. So charges that have been brought against Olivito were given to the College of Bishops, and then they'll be decided there.
And so that's basically 9 people?
Something like that, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Is there a time frame they're supposed to act on those charges?
Let's see. You're going to stretch my disciplinary knowledge. I believe that the timeline from when you receive the charge to when it has to be completed is 60 days, but it can be extended to 120 days, as I recall. Don't quote me on that, but I think that's the timeline. So most of the charges are beyond that 120 days already.
And what holds the College of Bishops accountable if they don't act on the charge?
Structurally, nothing at this point. Theoretically, they could get political pressure from their fellow bishops in other jurisdictions, but there doesn't seem to be much of a stomach for that. So we're kind of sort of stuck here at this point. Other questions?
Nothing really happened.
The water is more money now than it was previous.
Yeah.
It sounds that way.
Yeah. Yeah, you're expressing the sentiment I've heard from a lot of people, and honestly, over the course of General Conference, there were a lot of people who were very emotionally invested in the outcomes. There were a lot of people who were deeply upset by the outcomes on both sides. Frankly, there are people on both sides of this debate. Unfortunately, I heard you've probably encountered a lot of secular media. It hasn't been super blatant. There was an article on the front page of the Denver Post Friday that addressed it here. I know that Colorado Public Radio has done an interview, and at NPR, national NPR has done that. Several, New York Times did articles, Washington Post, various local papers have done news coverage of it, so it's been out there. I don't know where I was going with that, but that's been largely the sentiment that we spent. It was like $3.4 million putting on this conference last week, and there was another $1.5 million allocated for the Commission on a Way Forward. I understand they didn't use all of that, but they did use the majority of it. So we're in the neighborhood of somewhere around $4 million to come away with a few clarified definitions and a useless exit plan, essentially. I remember what I was going with that. So I was trying to keep up to date on all of the secular media coverage, anticipating that would be one place people would find some information and some misinformation, as the church, as you by now know, is super complicated and hard to understand if you're a Methodist, let alone if you're not. So I wanted to make sure that I could address any questions that may have come up. And I was listening to an interview with National Public Radio, where they had a phone interview with Bishop Olavito, and she said something that I think is true, actually, that we set up this general conference in a way as sort of a showdown that led to an up or down vote. And she said that when she's leading in churches, that if she felt like there was this much disagreement and that the body she was leading was this divided about something, that she would avoid a vote at all cost, because it does nothing but really hurt. It creates winners and losers. It creates nothing of the kind of consensus or a sense of moving forward. Now, I don't know how you build consensus right now, honestly, but unfortunately our system is set up to bring us to an up or down vote. And we are, as you can tell, about as evenly divided as you can be as a denomination.
It seems as if there are two issues besides all of the structural dynamics that happen in General Conference. One issue is, how do we as followers of Christ deal with the authority of Scripture? And what's its role in our daily lives for guidance? And that's one debate. The other debate seems to be about, what does it mean to love our neighbor? Does it mean acceptance? Does it mean that we draw a line over certain issues? So for me, those are the two things that it seemed as if we struggled with under all of the Robert's Rules of Order stuff. And you're right, we came out, right now the discipline that was adopted in 16 really is our Rules of Order right now.
Yeah. No, that's well said. I think you named those two issues were definitely an undercurrent throughout the entirety of this whole process, going back to, honestly, 1972, frankly. But that has been sort of the unspoken, assumed debate. We all kind of camp out in our answers to those questions, and then it gets expressed. I've long said that this issue over sexuality is really not the issue at all. This is really the way it's expressed right now, and it's the thing that it's the bone we're fighting over right now. But it's a result of, but not a cause of, our problems. It's a deeper division in theology and practice and perspective that's kind of undergirding these different perspectives in the United Methodist Church. Some of you may be wondering, so I mentioned 2020 is just around the corner. Our next meeting, the annual conference, will be meeting in Billings, Montana, coming up this July, or just this June, and we'll be electing our first delegation from the Mountain Sky Conference. They were still technically the Rocky Mountain and Yellowstone conferences at General Conference last week, but we'll be electing our first ever joint Mountain Sky delegation. The Rocky Mountain Conference had 3 clergy and 3 laity, and the Yellowstone Conference had the minimum 1 clergy and 1 laity. So every conference is guaranteed at least 1 of each. And so the Yellowstone was below the threshold where they could have more than 1 each, and so they had 1 each. And so over the Episcopal area, known as the Mountain Sky region, then we had essentially 4 clergy and 4 laity. Well, following the merger, we're going to lose the mandatory 1 and 1 from the Yellowstone Conference, and we're not going to add enough in population to the Rocky Mountain Conference in order to bump us up to another one. So there will only be, as I understand it, there will only be 3 clergy and 3 laity from the Mountain Sky Conference at the conference in 2020. As Bob pointed out, virtually every paragraph of the discipline is up for grabs at General Conference 2020. So everything we did now could be undone, redone, amended, changed, replaced, tweaked, left alone. It really depends on the body that comes to that conference. One of the things people have asked me is, why now? We've been fighting about this for 50 years. Why now? The simple answer is politics. And I say that not to be blunt, but it's a counting of votes, essentially. And the reality is that the United Methodist Church in the U.S. is shrinking every year. There was a report that came out through GCF&A. That's for those of you not playing the bingo game, GCF&A is the General Conference Finance and Administration. Those are the bean counters of the Methodist Church. They came out with a report that acknowledged a 3% drop in worship attendance across the United States in the denomination in 1 year, from 2016 to 2017. So as this was starting to kind of catch some steam, there was a 3% drop in worship attendance. As membership gets older or leaves over controversy or unfortunately passes on to a greater glory, the numbers in the U.S. keep shrinking, and the numbers in Africa are growing. Because if you look at the worldwide United Methodist Church, it's curious that our denomination is still growing, 11 million strong and growing, but the growth in Africa is actually outpacing the contraction in the United States. So as Africa gets more delegates, the United States gets fewer delegates, and the African delegations vote almost not uniformly. They're not a uniform kind of group, but they vote largely as a block for more traditional Orthodox perspectives. So what you had was about 40% of this last conference from outside the United States, and that 40% partnering with traditional Orthodox United Methodists in the United States to form that 55%, essentially, that passed the One Church plan. No, that passed the traditional plan, sorry. We got to come up with different names for these things. The reality is in 2020, those numbers begin to really shift, and there were some early estimations, and I haven't heard how solid these are, but there were some early estimations back in 2016 that by 2020 there would be more there'd be more international delegates than United States delegates to General Conference. Facing that reality, it was kind of do or die at this point. Not to put it in that language, but it was kind of, if we're going to change, it's probably going to be now, and the vote is going to get more lopsided as years go on. essentially, is the prevailing wisdom. So, Bob.
I don't mean this in a pejorative sense, but it sounds to me like the Methodist Church, like many institutions, invents a way to operate that makes it extraordinarily difficult to change.
That is true. Mhm. In some ways, strangely enough, it's almost too easy to change. But when it comes to difficult issues that deeply divide across all groups, I mean, you're talking about. It's no accident that we're in the midst of such a contentious political climate in the midst of our church going through this crisis. So, where people are deeply divided, change is very hard. Because, again, the way we set it up is winners and losers, right? So this person, there was always going to be just slightly more than half of the church that was going to be at least somewhat pleased with the results. And there was going to be just slightly less than half of the church that was going to be enraged by whatever happened. And it was just a matter of which side was going to be the slightly pleased and which side was going to be enraged. And honestly, when it comes to any sort of sense of church unity, I mean, apart from a miracle of God, I could have told you that was pretty hopeless 4 years ago, because we're so deeply divided over it. Yeah, that's it. And you know, it's unfortunate we find ourselves in this place. Before I was going to go to a close, so I don't want to close anybody off if anybody else has more questions. Yeah, Mike.
So this church is just going to keep on chugging the way we've been doing? There's going to be no real changes?
You stole my end line.
Troy said the same thing. I mean, he's little, and he said, well, I don't care what happens to the big church. Somebody here must have been excited, because as long as our church in Brighton don't change.
Mm-hmm.
So I think the little kids get it.
Yeah. I mean, we're obviously affected by this. I mean, the Cross and Flame was all over all the General Conference stuff. Our United Methodist name was in the news in the midst of this contentious battle. And that can't help but reflect on an individual, an individual congregation. But, I mean, apart from the sort of momentary, the funny thing is they kept saying all of the reports that I kept seeing reported that we're the second largest Protestant denomination in the United States, second only to the Southern Baptist Convention, and third only to the Southern Baptists and the Catholics. So we're the third largest Christian organization in the United States, United Methodist Churches, believe it or not. The mention of, gosh, it's been a long day, and I just totally forgot where I was going. Oh, that's going to bug me.
Reverend Joel, you reported in the different.
Uh-huh. Yep.
A friend of mine moved and sent me an email.
Mm-hmm.
Sorted it up online.
Mm-hmm.
I suspect you knew that.
Mm-hmm. Yep. I was one of, I think, 5 clergy that gave responses. I've been clear from the beginning in these meetings where I stand. I've also been clear that that's not going to change the way I love on you as people, and that's not going to change the way I hopefully lead our congregation. I've chosen not to preach about this intentionally. You may be wondering why. I've chosen not to preach about it because it's so divisive. It really, here's the thing. I listened to some podcasts with some interviews with the members of the Commission on a Way Forward. And one of the things that really struck me, Jessica LeGroin, is she's an ordained clergy person. She was a delegate to General Conference from the Texas Conference. She's what is it called? She's in charge of the chapel at Asbury Theological Seminary, which is one of the Methodist seminaries in Kentucky. And she was on the Commission on a Way Forward. as a traditional voice in the midst of that. And she said that one of the things that was really fascinating about the commission's work is that she'd been on the floor of General Conference and had been in those contentious debates and had sort of experienced that ire several times. But when they got together as a commission, it was about relationship. It was about, let's get together over a meal and talk about our positions. She said none of the 32 members of the commission on the way forward changed their minds about how they thought regarding the issues before them. But they had a deeper respect for each other as people because it was relational. And I think that's really what church is. And unfortunately, the General Conference and this method of doing sort of our global church life together has created a situation that basically devolved into people shouting into megaphones at each other and no one listening and nobody developing a relationship and nobody really honestly being the church, frankly. And unfortunately, when it gets to that level, it becomes very hurtful on all sides. And again, nobody winds up really happy. Nobody winds up feeling like we're really, going in any positive direction. So that's kind of where it's at. And so I think when it comes to the way how this affects us here, yes, it will likely bring conversations. If somebody's, oh, you're a member of the Methodist Church, you may get that, oh, I read about you in the Denver Post, I saw you on the news the other night. My prayer is that will die down quickly and that we can get back to the business of being church here and loving on each other and being the family of God. Because I think that's really where it's at. That's really where it's important. We can learn from each other. We can grow. We can be in ministry together. And that's where I'd like to focus our attention. Any other questions? Bob?
I guess we're about done. I just want to say thank you for holding this meeting and
Certainly.
doing all the homework you had to do to make this presentation.
It's been my goal throughout this whole process, as complicated as it is. It's kind of a weird quirk of mine. I don't like the results so much, but I am fascinated and I understand the machinery of the way we do things, and so I can grasp that, and it's interesting to me. So on one level, and of course it deeply affects me. I don't want what happened this past week to affect my ability to be your pastor. In practical, on the ground sort of ways where I can be with you in a crisis and pray with you and come to your hospital room and be with you in that moment, and I can celebrate with you when things go well and we can pray together, whatever it might be. We can serve in ministry together. I don't want to affect that. I also don't want it to affect my ability to officially be appointed here. And so I don't believe that's the case in the near future, at least. But yeah, my heart just breaks for churches that are going through this just like we are, and it's not a comfortable, and it's certainly not a peaceful place to be. So, but my hope has been to provide you all with as much information as you can handle, as I can provide for you, so that you at least know what's going on and can know sort of how it affects us.
So it really didn't change anything. Everything's still up in the air because of the judicial council.
Not everything's up in the air. I mean, once the judicial council rules at the end of April, we'll know specifically what the changes were, how those changes will affect practice in our higher realms of the denomination. That will just take time. And we probably won't know before the 2020 General Conference. So there you have it. Any other questions? All right, I'm grateful for you all and your interest, and please, I audio taped this. I don't know how well that turned out because I've been wandering around. I just realized that. But I do want to encourage you to be spokespeople. Not that you have to regurgitate everything I just told you. But if you hear somebody with questions and you feel like you can answer them now, I want you to feel empowered to answer them. If you're feeling like maybe you don't quite get it yet, or you're not sure, please send them to me. And I don't enjoy talking about this, but it is part of I think the pastoral care of ministry in the Methodist Church right now is helping people understand what happened and what it means. So please encourage anybody who have questions to come and visit with me. My door is always open, and I'm glad to share my thoughts about it with you. So thank you all for being here. I appreciate you all.